All right, so next I want to bring Katie Hatton to the stage, and I'm happy to introduce her. She's editor of the North Carolina Colonial Records Project and a staff member with DNCR's Historical Research Branch. Katie received her bachelor's in history from American University and her master's in public history from the University of South Carolina. In addition to past historical editing work, including the papers of the Pinckney brothers and Martin Van Buren, she brings experience working with museum and archaeological collections to her current projects. And we're very fortunate for the wonderful new information she's put together about the 1774 Edenton Petition, and so grateful for her for being here today to share it with us.
Perfect. Thank you very much. As Adrian said, my name is Katie Hatton. I'm the Colonial Records Editor here in the Office of Historical Research and Publications. Through that work, one thing that we've been working on in the lead up to the 250th of the Edenton Resolves and all the many commemorations that are going along, in part of that, I was tasked with creating 51 biographies of the signers of the Edenton Resolves. Strangely enough, though it is 250 years later, a comprehensive investigation into these women and their lives had never really happened before. So what we have here and what's available online as part of a larger exhibit put on by DNCR is kind of this first look into not just the Edenton Resolves as a document, but what it can tell us about these women and their lives and revolutionary society in general during this time of revolutionary North Carolina. So if you may not be familiar, I feel like DNCR is all about the Edenton Resolves these days, but just in case it's somehow missed you so far. In the fall of 1774, 51 women in Edenton undertook a revolutionary act. They signed a boycott in protest of British goods, and they gave their oaths to protest Britain's colonial taxation policies. This was later remembered as the Edenton Tea Party, and this event was an early example of women's political activism during the American Revolution. Now, it was not a tea party in the way that we think of it. It was probably more of a tea party in the way we might think of the Boston Tea Party, but that's the funny thing with history, you know. These things kind of create a legacy for themselves. So, let's see, this one. Maybe like one of these. Nope. Ah. Sorry. One of these. Okay. It's definitely moving here. It's just not, I don't know if it's frozen or. I appreciate your all patience with me here. I promise I normally know how to use a PowerPoint.
Okay.
Okay.
There we go.
Wrong tab. Thank you very much. So the Edenton Resolves themselves, one thing that we may not realize when we're talking about it is that no original document for this event is known to have survived. If anyone in the audience has one in their attic, I'd love to take a look at it. But in the meantime, what we generally work off of is an early newspaper article that was a reprint of the Resolves once they were signed. Obviously, this is helpful. It's very easy to read, but it also leaves us with some questions about what was the nature of how this signing took place. We can't look at the original, we can't compare handwriting, things like that, to know exactly what was going on. So this document is dated October 25th, 1774, and it's an agreement where 51 women promised to support the North Carolina Provincial Congress's resolves to boycott British goods. We'll look a little bit at the text of the actual Edenton Resolves themselves, but nowhere in this document does it say anything about tea or, you know, specifically a boycott or anything like that. However, we know based on the context of what was happening within North Carolina at the time, that this is what they're talking about. But in order to understand this document a little bit better, we should probably look a little bit further back, 1 year earlier than this to be precise, to understand why exactly all of this is happening in the first place. So to set the scene, for those of you who may not be aware, Edenton is out in the northeastern part of North Carolina. It's the county seat of Chowan County. Although not the capital of North Carolina at the time, it was still one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the colony. The women of the Edenton region, however, were not just thinking about themselves specifically within the area of Edenton when making the resolves. Instead, they were thinking about the colonies, about the 13 colonies or North America as a whole when thinking about the resolves. And to start with that, we have to look farther north towards Massachusetts to explore rising revolutionary sentiment. So the Boston Tea Party, perhaps the more famous of the two tea parties, came about as a result of policies after the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War. Following that war, the British government was in a financial crisis and it needed to make money to recoup the losses it had spent fighting this very costly war. In 1767, the Parliament enacted the Townshend Acts, which were a series of laws meant to directly tax North American colonists for goods such as glass, paper, and tea. Colonists, however, found these policies very unpopular. It was taxation without representation. They did not have representatives in Parliament who could approve these new laws. So they found it very unpopular, like Americans still very much do. So all in our historic political tradition. So Parliament eventually repealed these Townshend duties, except for one specifically on tea. In June 1773, Parliament passed a new act, this one called the Tea Act. You can guess what it did. It gave the East Indian Company a monopoly on tea and other colonial trade. A few months later, 3 ships arrived into the Boston harbor laden with East Indian tea. Colonists predictably were very unhappy with this recent Tea Act, and they called for more boycotts. Last time they had a lot of boycotts after the Townshend Acts and they had gotten their way. So it just made sense. We boycott this one, Parliament listens, and we go about our way. However, that didn't actually tend to be the case this time. When the colonial protesters went to the colony's governor to ask for them to send the tea back to England, he refused. But the colonists were not ones to take this matter laying down. Instead, a group of protesters called the Sons of Liberty boarded 3 ships in the Boston harbor during the night of December 16th, 1773. And one of them, the Eleanor, as illustrated here. And they dumped these chests of tea into the Boston harbor, 340 chests in all. And this event later became known as the Boston Tea Party that we've all heard of. Now, colonists had hoped that the news of this when the news of this tea's destruction reached England, it'd give Parliament pause. It'd be this wake-up call to tell them, you need to reevaluate your policies. You need to be more fair about taxation and representation, things like that. That wasn't the case, as we all know. Instead, Parliament wanted to punish the people of Massachusetts and strengthen their authority in the colony. They didn't want anything like this to undermine their rule ever again. So in June 1774, again, 6 months later, it takes a long time for news to get across the ocean to England and back. In June 1774, Parliament enacted a series of laws called the Coercive or the Intolerable Acts. The first of these acts is called the Boston Port Act, and that closed the Boston harbor until the colony paid for the destroyed tea. Now, this was considered very extreme because only a small group of the Sons of Liberty had done this damage, but now we're closing the entire port for the whole colony until this damage is repaid. Basically halting the colony's economy due to the actions of a few individuals. The Parliament also revoked Massachusetts' charter, placing the colony under direct royal control. Not a good thing if you're already complaining about taxation and representation. They also restricted the colonists' right to assemble or hold large meetings. Again, they don't want these large protests like what happened at the Boston Tea Party. So these intolerable acts that I'm describing here only apply to Massachusetts. They don't apply to North Carolina or any of the other colonies. But as the news circulated, it sent shockwaves throughout all of North America. Many colonists, even ones that supported Parliament's former actions thought that these swift and harsh punishments for Massachusetts set a dangerous precedent. For these concerned citizens, the recent acts were signs of governmental overreach. As British authorities soon found out, these intolerable acts would become a uniting force as patriots from all 13 colonies came together to oppose the new laws. So one of the ways that North Carolina immediately decided to protest these intolerable acts was through the first provincial Congress. So as I said, intolerable acts do not affect North Carolina directly, but the legislation motivated colonists in North Carolina to do something in response to support their compatriots in Massachusetts. So on August 25th, 1774, 71 delegates representing 30 of North Carolina's counties assembled at the Craven County Courthouse in New Bern. They came together to decide how we're going to respond to these new acts and support the people of Massachusetts. This gathering was called the Provincial Congress. It was the first meeting of its kind held in the 13 colonies, because unlike the Colonial Assembly, this wasn't approved by royal authority. This was considered independent or extra legal outside of what England and Parliament allowed. So later that year, other colonies would follow in North Carolina's footsteps and also hold their own provincial congresses to discuss principles of self-government. The people in North Carolina at New Bern called the Boston Port Act, quote, a most cruel infringement on the rights and privileges of the people of Boston. And the North Carolinians in New Bern resolved, among many other things, this document is several pages long, but one of the most relevant ones for our discussion here today, they said, quote, that the duties imposed by several acts of the British Parliament among tea and other articles consumed in America are highly illegal and oppressive. So because of this complaint, because of their issue with the Tea Act, North Carolinians resolved that all delegates who signed this document at the Provincial Congress would boycott all imports from the East India Tea Company, including the tea as well as anything else. They called for unity amongst the North American colonies, and the delegates swore to only deal with other colonies who adopted similar boycotts in support of Massachusetts. Say, for example, Virginia followed Parliament's lead. North Carolinians were saying, we won't deal with Virginia anymore in that, hypothetical idea. So the Provincial Congress ends its meeting, and the final thing that they do before ending their meeting is they elect 3 men to serve as North Carolina's representatives to the Continental Congress to be held in Philadelphia the following month. Like the Provincial Congress, but larger, the Continental Congress hosted delegates from 12 colonies. These delegates would then later write a petition to the King of England asking for a repeal of these intolerable acts and the Tea Acts and everything else that I've described. This Continental Congress also, several sittings later, would be the ones to write and publish the Declaration of Independence. So all because of, by this impetuous of the Tea Act, the intolerable acts, kind of sets in motion all these things happening in North Carolina that then kind of have shockwaves and sparks in other parts of the colonies and lead to eventually to independence. So it's at this point in the story that we can then return to the Edenton Tea Party resolves, or just the Edenton resolves, perhaps more exactly. So as the people from the Provincial Congress, because again, they represented all the different counties within North Carolina, as they're returning home to their respective places, they're bringing with them news of what they decided to do at these recent meetings in New Bern. These resolves are also published in local papers, and news of the boycotts came to Edenton via word of mouth and from the congressional delegates themselves. So throughout September and October of 1774, the women in Edenton, just like the men and everyone in general, would be talking about these recent boycotts, the acts, what was happening in Massachusetts, how we're going to respond, the uncertain times, all sorts of conversations like this are happening all at once. So these ideas about taxation without representation, the intolerable acts, are all swirling around in Edenton at the time. And ultimately, 51 women decide to take a stand. echoing the provincial Congress's resolves that Parliament's treatment of Massachusetts was unjust. They write their own resolution where they too agree to boycott the importation of British goods until Parliament repeals the intolerable acts, basically echoing what has just happened at the provincial Congress. So here I'll just take a look at the resolves specifically themselves, because this is old-fashioned language. It's not necessarily clear upon a first reading what exactly it's saying, so we can just kind of break it down. So this is the entirety of their resolves. They were much more pithy and succinct than the men's first draft at the provincial Congress. So they say, as we cannot be indifferent on any occasion that appears to affect the peace and happiness of our country. And so when they say the peace and happiness of our country, they're talking about the intolerable acts and how they are affecting the colonies. They're saying the intolerable acts are affecting our peace and happiness. And as it has been thought necessary for the public good to enter into particular resolves by a meeting of the members. So this meeting of the members is the provincial Congress that we just mentioned. They're from the whole province, and it is the duty which we owe not only to our near and dear connections. So near and dear connections, meaning 3 women who actually signed the document, some of the leading women who are on the top list of signers, their spouses were delegates to this provincial Congress. So it's a duty we owe not just to our near and dear connections who have concurred in them, but to ourselves. It's a thing that they're taking on for themselves that they also believe in, not just echoing what their husbands or their fathers or brothers are saying, but it's a conviction that they hold themselves. To do everything as far as lies in our power to testify our sincere adherence to the same. So sincere adherence to the same, meaning they too vow to uphold a boycott, to not deal with the East India Company until Parliament hears their demands. And we do therefore accordingly subscribe this paper as a witness of our fixed intention and solemn determination to do so, i.e. they're going to sign the document now. So this is the kind of more interesting part, and this is where I based a lot of my research on, and that's specifically breaking down who the signers are, what their backgrounds are, and what it meant for them to sign this document. So just briefly, I'll say that signing one's name to a public protest like this, especially one that was going to be printed in newspapers, even sent to England. Some later tellings of this story say that they addressed it specifically to the King of England. He read it and was so upset. We can't prove any of that, but it definitely went to England. It was definitely printed in London newspapers. People definitely saw it. It was commented on, but I can't say whether King George had any particular opinion on it. But signing this, publishing it like it was no small act. Just as the whole of Massachusetts was punished for the events of the Boston Tea Party, it's not unreasonable to think that the women who signed the Edenton resolves might face harsh consequences when the British government heard of their protests. Would they punish all of North Carolina for the actions of a few like they did in Massachusetts? So the women who signed these resolves did so even though they had something to lose. Here are some statistics kind of breaking down what I found out about these women as I identified them. So one thing that I found surprising immediately was that the average age of a signer was 35 years old. Of the 45 signers who I've been able to identify, 84% of them were married. So this isn't just the thing happening at your local college or high school that we're all just going to get in together on this protest for. These are people with a lot of responsibilities. They're not just caught up in the moment. This decision to sign is a deliberate one, and one in which the women likely carefully weighed their options, thinking not only about their own political beliefs, but also the responsibilities that they owe to their spouses, children, and larger communities. So again, of the signers that we've been able to identify, only about 30% of them we can prove lived specifically in Edenton. This was a document that was passed around the larger region. About 15% of the signers are from Bertie County. A much larger percentage are from the not just specifically Edenton, but Chowan County as a whole. Most are married. And then finally, it's a little bit difficult to see here, but there's a variety of colors next to each of the signers' names. As I discovered kind of through this web of genealogy, not probably very surprising for those of you that work in this era, about 80% of these women were related to at least one other woman. So these dots represent the various ways that different people were related. As you can see at the top, the first 5 signers all have the same color dot next to them, a green dot. They are all related. They're sisters-in-laws or direct sisters, things like that. So even though these women have, different last names, they're still very much tied together. And that's actually a really helpful sign when trying to identify these women, especially as we get down towards the bottom here. There's actually 3 women all named Elizabeth Roberts all together in a row. So that's not a typo. It's not just an issue of the newspaper printer. There actually is a mother, a daughter, and then a daughter-in-law that are all Elizabeth Roberts. Why this one son decided the only woman he could marry in town was also named Elizabeth, very inconvenient for me, but I guess the heart wants what the heart wants. So the biographies of all these signers are broken down on our website, which I'll share in a little bit. But I thought it might be interesting to kind of identify some of the more key players or more identifiable or interesting backgrounds of some of the different women that signed this document. So the first one, perhaps the most famous of them all, is Penelope Barker. So a lot of stories about this document say that Penelope Barker was the orchestrator, that she did all of this. She specifically sent it to King George, all those sorts of things. I can't say whether or not that's true. If she was the orchestrator, I think it's a little bit strange that she signs it in like fifth or sixth place. She's not the first one, but maybe she was humble. I can't say for sure. I wasn't there. But whether it was her or not, she certainly had the leadership skills and organizational capacity available to do such a thing. At the time of the signing, Penelope Barker's husband, Thomas, had been away for 13 years, working most of that time as an agent for the colony's interests in Britain. Through the Barkers' correspondence, it's clear that Penelope was responsible for the day-to-day management of their very expansive property. And her husband's absence for this 13 years was by no means the only hardship that Penelope had faced in her life. She had a legacy of kind of facing a lot of hard choices, just like the decision to sign the Edenton Resolves. At the age of 17, she lost her sister Elizabeth and subsequently married Elizabeth's widow, John Hodson, becoming the stepmother to her 3 nieces and nephews. Just 2 years later, her husband Hodgson died, leaving Penelope, still a teenager, with 5 children to care for, all under the age of 10 or so. Penelope was widowed a second time in 1755 when her next husband, James Craven, died. And so by the time of the signing of the Edenton Resolves in 1774, Penelope had borne the loss of not only 2 of her husbands, but also all 5 of her biological children. At the time of the resolve signing, after the resolves were signed, I should say, Penelope's husband finally returned home in 1778, a full 17 years after he had just been out for a second to go to England, just gonna pop over and come right back. The couple later built a house together, and that house still stands at the Edenton waterfront. It's a very iconic image if you've ever been to Edenton, and it is the welcome center for the Edenton Historical Commission today. So aside from perhaps our most notable signer, I also have a collection of some that are perhaps a little bit lesser known. So one of them is the churchwarden's daughter, Anne Hall. She was one of the youngest signers, aged just 20 years old at the time of the signing. Unlike the vast majority of the signers, Anne was unmarried, and given her signature's placement on the document, she probably followed her mother and her older sister Mary in signing her name. Now, the Halls were an old and notable family in the area. Her father, Clement, was an Anglican missionary and was also the author of the first non-legal text published in North Carolina. He published a collection of poems. But he died very unexpectedly when Anne was just 4 years old, leaving Anne's mother on a diminished income. Clement Hall, as a missionary, was paid by the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. It was this organization funded by the Church of England that was supposed to support religion in the colonies. And Anne's mother actually went to this society and said, hey, we're here because you want religion to be here in North Carolina. My husband put his life on the line trying to spread this religion. I have 2 young kids to care for. Can you help me out here? I need some money. And they actually did not support her claim. So it's possible that this issue of funding and this sentiment that the Church of England or England more generally had abandoned them as a family could have possibly soured them towards British policy. Whatever the reason, Anne, her mother, and 2 of her sisters ultimately signed the resolves. And the family support of this evolving patriot cause doesn't stop here either. Anne's older brother, Clement Jr., was an officer in the Continental Army, and she herself later married the colonel of the Chowan County Regiment of the North Carolina Militia, a man named James Blunt. So we have these kind of humble stories of, an English missionary's daughter. We also have heiresses that are signing this same document. So Penelope Johnson, as I was kind of looking into her story, was perhaps what struck me as one of the most unlikely signers of these Edenton resolves. Several of her cousins, to be fair, also signed the document. So, I'm sure it was in the family. It was something that people were talking about. But she, unlike them, was the daughter of a former royal governor of North Carolina, Gabriel Johnston. And her ties to the British establishment didn't stop there either. Her grandfather was Charles Eden, also a former colonial governor. And through these connections, Penelope was the heiress to an immense fortune. Now, Penelope was orphaned when she was age 11. Gabriel Johnston was long gone by the time of the American Revolution and the Edenton Resolves. In this kind of intermediary time, she fell under the guardianship of another royal governor, Virginia's Governor Robert Dinwiddie. Spending her time half between Edenton and half between Williamsburg, she enjoyed a cosmopolitan lifestyle and was unusually highly educated as compared to her peers. This is all to say that her fortunes were intensely tied to the British Empire. But despite these ties, Penelope also perhaps had a bit of a rebellious streak. In 1780 and 1758, she eloped with John Dawson, a young surveyor from Virginia, even though her family did not agree to the match. She's like, well, I have enough money to support us both. It doesn't really matter. I like him. And they eventually settled in Eden House, the Governor Charles Eden, her grandfather's former estate. And it was there in 1774 that she signed the resolves and affixed her name in protest of Great Britain's policies. So we have people like heiresses, Penelope Dawson, perhaps one of the wealthiest women in the colony at the time. And we also have Anne Horniblow, who was married to a tavern keeper. So a lifelong resident of Chowan County. There we go. She came from a family of skilled craftspeople. Her father, John Rombo, was a joiner and cabinet maker, and 2 of Anne's brothers also followed him into woodworking. When she was 18, her parents actually arranged for her marriage to local tavern keeper John Horniblow. And as Mrs. Horniblow, she would have worked beside her husband in the tavern, keeping drinks filled, the floor swept, fires stoked. It was there, surely, that Anne heard many of the political debates of the day, such as questions about taxation without representation, the balance between royal authority and democracy. On these political questions, Anne too sided with the Patriots. Aged about 20, she signed the resolves and pledged to support the colonial boycott movement. And sources suggest that Anne's decision to sign the document had the full support of her family. Not only did her husband later sign a similar oath, but her father was also a member of the Edenton Committee of Safety, an early form of kind of patriot governance in this vacuum between when the British are ruling and then we're kind of establishing an American political system. So aside from tavern keepers, we also have Elizabeth Johnston. Elizabeth Johnston was actually born Elizabeth Williams. She was born over in Bertie County. Her father's name actually was William Williams, very memorable. And what do you do when your dad's name is William Williams? Well, you marry John Johnson. So Elizabeth Johnson's marriage sparked the melding of two important political families in northeastern North Carolina. Her father, William Williams, had represented the local area in the North Carolina Colonial Assembly, and by the time Elizabeth signed the Edenton Resolves, her husband John was serving in that body as well. There was this brief time where there was both provincial Congress and a colonial assembly. It was very confusing for everyone involved. And perhaps spurred on by her support of the boycott, both her father and her husband later served as delegates to that provincial Congress body. At the time of the outbreak of the American Revolution, Elizabeth's family's patriotic fervor had not diminished. John served as the clerk of the Bertie County Court, where he swore local citizens allegiance to the state of North Carolina. If you don't swear, we will take all of your land and kick you out of the state. So it's a pretty big and important job. And then meanwhile, her father was also a colonel in the Martin County Regiment of the North Carolina Militia. The county seat of Williamston is now named after him. But these are just a kind of a few snapshots of some of the various professions and various backgrounds that these women had coming into the signing of the Edenton Resolves. There's certainly more to discover. I was able to find and research biographies for 45 of the 51 signers. There's a couple that I just can't really find much about. Sometimes, they passed unexpectedly right after that, and there's very little mention of their names. But I'm certainly still looking for those remaining 5. There's also an online exhibit about the history and legacy of the Edenton Resolves. How did it become to be known as this Tea Party? There's this kind of famous satirical image of the Edenton Resolves. People often think that that's a real image of what happened at the Edenton Resolves. All those sorts of things, different markers and monuments that have gone up to these women and their contributions through the years. So that, along with a searchable database of over 3,000 different archival documents, the vast majority of them housed here at the state archives, and their transcriptions are all together in one database. So even though we might just see the Edenton Resolve signers as people who signed this one singular document, by going into this database on Mosaic, you can kind of see how they're mentioned in wildly other exhibits. They'll be mentioned in letters from when they're young children or when they're much older. And through these kinds of databases of transcriptions, we can kind of put together more sense about what their lives were like in a more fuller picture. And finally, I do just want to mention all the images that I got for this PowerPoint today are from a new children's book that actually was just released by our office. So it's by Sally Walker with illustrations by John Voss. John Voss is actually a local illustrator based in Wake Forest. This is a children's book. It was released just last month for readers between the ages of 8 and 11, published by our office, distributed by UNC Press. It was released for the celebration of the 250th of these resolves. And the online exhibit is kind of the more scholarly or adult component to go with that. But the book has some of the illustrations I've shown you here. And that's just a few of the really great full color illustrations in the book are there as well. I think it'd make a lovely Christmas present or anything like that for some history appreciators in your lives. But that's all I have. I'd be happy to take any questions if there are some, but otherwise just, yeah, thank you very much for having me and hearing my talk today. Sure. Hold on, Troy. Microphone.
Here comes Johnny.
Might be like the PowerPoint. Mm-hmm. Yes, certainly. Yes, yes. Yeah, I've been in contact, not specifically with the Kubla House, but with the Edenton Historical Commission. Alexis Tobias Jacobone over there has been a great help in kind of putting together some parts of this kind of exhibit that I talked about that talks more about like the various markers and monuments and how those came to be. So some things from Hayes Plantation, some things from there as well were definitely very helpful in kind of putting together all of this.
Cool, and then I had a question.
Sure.
It's working. Okay. Then I had a question. Yes, it is working. I had a master's student who wrote her thesis on the Edenton Resolves and Tea Party. And, you know, she did a good job, but her argument was that the Edenton Resolves was a feminist document. What is your opinion on that?
I mean, I think, you know, I was never one much for theory myself, I'm sorry to admit. You know, I think it can certainly be a feminist document in that it's, you know, it is a group of women taking action for themselves. No one has put them up to this. There's no male secretary who's dictating this or anything as far as we can tell. It's entirely led by women. It was pretty unconventional for the time. Women were considered to be kind of more in a private sphere. So in all those ways, it's certainly groundbreaking. It's the first known collective political action by women in the 13 colonies. So in all of those ways, it's very much a radical document. However, does that mean that there's, you know, suddenly a group of, you know, one London writer, when reading this, joked that there would be a group of Edenton female artillery marching up and down the streets. You know, it's, you know, we're not, you know, marching on anywhere. It's not, you know, becoming this large protest movement in that way. But, you know, clearly these women are very educated and are thinking about themselves as political actors in that way. So I do think that in that way, it's certainly a feminist document. Any other questions? Certainly.
Your presentation was very good. Thank you. I'm interested to know, you know, what inspired you? What made you pick this particular area? And I to piggyback on the gentleman's comment, definitely feminist. We may not have had that word back then,
Certainly.
but these women, I know just historically, not in detail about the suffrage movement, in the beginning, they had to have a man to like stand up and say, okay, we can listen to these women. And so what makes this special is that this group of women, even though they were related to men who were in politics, but it seems like they've taken the bull by the horn themselves. And that's commendable, especially at that time.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, absolutely. So getting to your question about kind of how we came to this topic, my supervisor actually has been kind of the guiding force in creating this series of children's books. This is the first and actually a series of 4 children's books related to the American 250th founding, North Carolina history sorts of topics. So I was actually assigned this book as kind of the fact checker for the book. Our author that we worked with for this book, Sally Walker, is fantastic, phenomenal, but is not like a subject matter expert. She's a children's book writer and a very good one at that. So I was assigned it as more of kind of just like a fact checking thing. And it was kind of like, well, it doesn't seem like there's really any sources for a lot of this stuff. I was having to go through, you know, very intensive primary source research to try and get her answers about like, what would some of these women's backgrounds would have been or things like that. And so I just kind of approached my supervisor saying, you know, it really seems like no one has identified the full totality of these women's experiences yet. So like, what do you think if I did that and we kind of packaged it together as an online component for the children's book? And she was very amenable to that. And it's been a really big success in helping attract people to our website and the offerings that we have there, as well as the children's book, the ongoing 250th commemorations, things like that. So it was kind of a mix of being voluntold and also just really seeing that there was an issue and that there was a way for us to correct this so that other historians wouldn't have to kind of remake the wheel on this in the future.
So the myth you always hear is that 1/3 of North Carolina was loyalist, 1/3 was patriot, and 1/3 was neutral.
Hmm.
So I'm wondering if you're looking at the biographies of the women that you found, did you see anywhere other members of their families had, were loyalists or were involved in loyalist experiences? Because you always hear about families that may have been, house divided, where you had loyalist
Certainly.
and patriot leanings.
As far as I can tell, for a lot of these women, they were all like generally quite patriot. Now there's cases where like an adult brother has broken off or things like that, but I don't find any cases of, like the loyalist militia captain and his wife signing the Edenton Resolves. That would be very, very exciting. But generally, I'd say that Edenton, more than others, was a little bit of a hotbed of this kind of patriot activity, perhaps due to these women's influences. But there's certainly some cases, but Chowan County specifically doesn't have as much of that Tory sentiment, so it's harder to find those connections.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. So I visited Edenton for the first time recently, and a shop owner was telling the story. And after listening to your presentation, I'm thinking maybe it was a little bit of a fishtail, but I've been proudly sharing this story. I just came back from Colorado, and its story goes like this, that the Tea Party in Edenton by the women was occurred before the Tea Party in Boston.
Unfortunately, no.
That's what I
was-
wanted to confirm.
Yes.
And the second part of the story was that by signing the document, unlike the men up in Boston who did it at night and were hidden or decorated themselves to appear like Native Americans, these women signed a document, and that was threatening for them to do that. So there was a fearlessness about them, and I wanted to explore that topic too.
Yes, certainly. That's a great point to bring up, and one I did mean to bring up. So I appreciate you mentioning it. But yeah, certainly when we think of even like the founding fathers, people like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, a lot of times when they're publishing things in the newspapers around this time, they're using pseudonyms. They're using like references to old like Roman generals and leaders, things like that. So even like the famous Silence Do Good as Benjamin Franklin's pen name, these people, when they're publishing, they don't often use their own name. So it is very remarkable that these women are using their own names. I think that is what gives the Resolves so much of the traction that it has, is that it's not just saying, these are from concerned women and mothers of the Edenton area. They're very much standing behind their beliefs in a way that not necessarily was even common for the men of that time, certainly.
And then I have a follow-up question about the risk that some of the signers may have taken. You mentioned Penelope Dawson and her vast fortune. Was that at risk by achieving independence or by signing? And then also, I think I've read somewhere, but I'm very hazy, Penelope Barker's husband was in London and maybe he suffered some consequences.
Right, yeah. So, yeah, I'll take that in two parts. Penelope Dawson, certainly, I don't know where exactly she kept her funds, colonial currency and money. It's all this kind of credit system that's very difficult to track, let alone understand. So, it's certainly possible that had things gone the other way, that, Britain would have been very punitive in its punishment for resolves like this one, either the larger provincial Congress resolves or this. So, in that kind of version of history where the Patriots were not ultimately successful, they certainly would have, found trouble for allying themselves with what would be considered an insurgent cause. At the same time, as the war progressed, it would have been really bad for your fortunes to not ally with the Patriot cause. Lots of people who were also in positions of prominence with the British Empire lost a whole lot of money and lost their lands and had to leave and faced physical violence, things like that. So it was really a toss-up in that regard. And then secondly, Thomas Barker, we don't particularly have notice of him facing punishment for his wife's name appearing in the document. It could have happened. We just don't really have a lot of sources on that. Unfortunately, from what we can tell, it was kind of a little bit derided in England when it arrived. They immediately made a satirical cartoon about it. People were talking about the female artillery, things like that. It doesn't necessarily seem like they took this as a statement very seriously, or at least acted as though they weren't concerned about it, you know, that kind of bravado. It certainly didn't hurt, you know, Thomas's business interests. He was still the agent of the colony. But later, when the war got a little bit more intense in 1778, he actually did have to escape England via like France and Spain to get back to America. There was kind of a no-fly list at the time, but for boats, if you get my meaning. But that was never directly tied to, you know, his wife's political affiliations, though I'm sure it didn't help. Any other questions? Well, if that's all, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.